What's up guys, and today we are talking about DNFs, did not finish. Have you ever done one? If you have, I want to know. I, of course, have DNF'd a race. I'm pretty sure it's only one. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's only one that I've DNF'd. But really, I want to hear from you. So I have found an article in Trail Runner magazine, and they talk about DNFs and the reasons that we DNF. Or I suppose there could be many reasons for not finishing a race, but there are a few that are pretty obvious. And when I tell you, you're going to be like, oh yeah, of course. And this article that I found in Trail Runner magazine is called How to Know When to DNF. So you're going to learn something today. Not finishing a race that we have set out to do is, oftentimes a nightmare. Before it happens, it seems like worst case scenario, but I'm going to tell you when. And again, like everything I talk about on this channel, it's going to be pretty obvious. But that's fun, and that's how I get you to keep coming back, because when I talk about obvious things, it triggers confirmation bias, and you think, yeah, that's what I think too. Anyway, if that sounds like fun, stick around. Oh guys, by the way, I will put a link to this article in the show notes below, so if you want to go ahead and read through the article, click on the link and check it out. So I did mention how not finishing a race is probably pretty much a nightmare scenario, especially when we've put so much time into getting to the race, to training for the race. We've probably paid money to run this race, and then of course if it's a destination race, you're paying for travel, you're paying for accommodation, not to mention all the food, although you'd probably be eating anyway. But running shoes certainly don't come cheap, especially if you maintain a healthy rotation and you have training shoes and tempo shoes and race day shoes. All this adds up. And then there's the time investment. You don't just roll up to the start of a marathon and run it. You have been training for weeks, for months in order to get to the start line. You're likely putting in between, 5 and 12 hours a week, depending on your level. So that adds up. It becomes a big part of your life and you become really invested in achieving this goal. So the thought of not doing it is pretty devastating. And yet it happens all the time. Oh, by the way, because this article is in Trail Runner magazine, it is talking about ultramarathons. So some of the stats that I'll mention are based on ultramarathons, and of course if you read it you'll see that, but I think it translates into road running, especially the longer distances, because let's be honest, most people are probably not going to DNF a 5K. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but it doesn't happen as often as it does in full marathons and ultramarathons. But listen, saying that, if you have DNF'd a 5K, no shame, you don't have to let us know, or you can, whatever makes you feel best. So typically marathons have a lower DNF rate than some ultramarathons. In fact, I think the Badwater race has about a 40% DNF rate, and then the Leadville 100 this year had a 56% did not finish rate. So look, if you're only running road marathons, it could always be worse. You could be out on a course for 24 hours or more, and of course the longer you're out there, the more chances you're going to have to stumble across something that makes you not able to finish the race. So why do athletes not finish their race? Typically it's because of one of three things. We've got injury, we've got illness, and we've got mental challenges. And I'll just take a brief aside to tell you about the one time that I didn't finish a race, and that was because of mental challenges. And it's really funny looking back as to why I did it, because I was actually in the lead when I dropped from the marathon. But I got to, just over the halfway point, maybe 16 miles, and I was running by the car, and I realized I just had enough. I just didn't feel like being out there that day. And I gotta say, that's probably the worst reason to drop from a race. Like, there's no excuse. I just couldn't be bothered. So certainly not proud of that one, but it happens. And the great thing is that we always find a way to justify the reason for not finishing a race. Sometimes those justifications are actually justified. Other times, like in my case, they're not. I justified it by saying, well, I've run so many marathons and I have more on the schedule, so this one really doesn't make a difference. I'm not feeling like it. I think I'm just going to go home. So I highly recommend you don't do that, because I think most times that you will remember not finishing a race, it's probably not going to be something that you actually bring up in conversation years down the road. And my DNF happened years ago, and yet here I am today still talking to you guys about it. So there's probably a little shame there. Anyway, not my finest moment. And a funny lesson that I've actually learned in other races is that even when things go bad and you push through and you want to stop but you don't, the feeling of satisfaction that you get from finishing something that you don't think you can is astronomical. It can't be understated. It's a really good feeling. So if I had pushed through, in all likelihood I would have won, but the win would have come secondary to pushing through these mental challenges that I was having. Anyway, that really got off topic. Injury, illness, mental challenges. But saying that, there was actually a study in 2022. It was conducted by the American Trail Running Association, and it included 1,200 participants. And they found that the top reasons for DNFing a race was getting injured during the race, not making a cutoff time, and illness, or getting sick when you're racing. So the two are the typical ones. We've got injury and illness. Mental challenges did not make it into the top three, but not making a cutoff time was a big reason that people did not finish. I don't think there's anything wrong with not making your cutoff time. That's the reason that you can't finish a race, then so be it. You gave it your best shot, you didn't meet the criteria, so you couldn't finish. Like, it is what it is. That's not actually a you problem, it's a them problem. There's also some interesting statistics that came out from the Western States 100, and it found that 54% of the 2023 races and 69% of the 2022 races that DNF'd did not use a coaching service. Furthermore, 59% of 2023 and 68% of 2022 races that DNF did not attend a training camp for the Western States Run 100. And that training camp basically just allows runners to get familiarized with the course, so they know what they're going into. They're going into the race eyes wide open, they know the terrain, they know some of the climbs. So this brings up the question that not finishing a race is also probably correlated with not preparing for the race. Of course, this isn't always the case, and if you are running road half marathons or marathons and even ultra marathons, it's unlikely that you're actually previewing the course before you actually go and run it. In fact, I can actually say that unless I had run a race previously, I have never previewed a course before running it. But I don't think that's what the article is getting at. The article is not saying that if you don't preview a course, you have a higher chance of DNFing. I think it's just implying that preparation leads to success. But that's not exactly a mind-blowing concept, is it? So speaking of preparation, if we think about some scenarios, if we think about some options that we have that could prevent us from DNFing, or scenarios that would lead to a DNF, that is actual mental preparation in itself, and that can lead us to lowering the chances that we actually DNF. And the Trail Run article actually cites a sports psychologist who says that the best way to combat a poor mental attitude later in the race is to have an ideal mental attitude before you actually start the race. And look, I think this is easier said than done. Like right now, you're looking at me and I seem like a jolly, happy-go-lucky runner who just likes to talk to himself in his office. But really, I harbor some doubts about the races that I go to, and I have to mentally combat that. I have to be aware that I'm having negative thoughts about my races, because if I let it run away with me, then it could lead to a dark place. That dark place could be mid-race when I'm not feeling good and I choose to drop out. That reminds me, in 2018, when I was running the Boston Marathon, I was having a terrible time. It was that year when it was cold and wet, and I remember it was quite early in the race. I don't know, Framingham maybe? I was actually looking around to see if there was like a train nearby that could take me into Boston, because that's where I was meeting my family, and then I could just go home from there. Luckily, there wasn't a train nearby, or at least it wasn't easily apparent, and I went and I dug deep and I finished the race. And of course, I got to benefit from overcoming that negative mental attitude by feeling really good about it after the race, even though it was touch and go during the race. Anyway, I guess my point is that you've got to have a good attitude going into the race so you can maintain that good attitude when it really counts, when things start to hurt during the race. So this sports psychologist says there is a sweet spot, and the sweet spot is going to be different for everyone. But basically, this feeling is a blend of confidence, excitement, mixed with a little bit of calmness, and then mixed again with some nerves, but a healthy dose of nerves. Not the level of nerves that just overcomes you and you can't do anything. Guys, you want to be nervous before you start a race. You're about to push yourself. You're about to do something difficult. And the sports psychologist in the article says that if you're feeling a little too jittery or too sleepy or even just unmotivated at the start of the race, that can spell disaster later on. And I thought about this because I've never felt too jittery. I've never felt too sleepy, even when I haven't slept the night before a race. Usually I've had coffee, I'm excited for the race, so I'm not feeling sleepy, but I certainly have felt unmotivated before I start a race. So that's something I'm trying to train myself into, actually feeling motivated. But then, of course, motivation, as I've said 100 times before in these videos, motivation isn't worth anything. Discipline is what matters. And if you just start the race, then that motivation will build on itself. So actually, I think I just contradicted everything I'm talking to you about today, because discipline builds motivation. But seriously, if you can be motivated at the start of your race, please do so. Probably going to lead to feeling better during the race. So how do you do that? How do you feel not too jittery, not too sleepy, motivated? You want to have a blend of nerves, calmness, excitement. How do you develop those feelings? Well, they give an idea, and they say that you have to think back to a race where you've had all these things, or you think back to a race where you did better than you thought you would, or performed well, and you harness those feelings. Basically, it's a confidence game. You've got to be confident. You've got to be confident in yourself moving forward at the beginning of the race, and then you can tap into that when it really matters, when things start to get a bit dicey a couple hours in. So this next part is where it kind of digresses from normal road running or a normal marathon, because when you're running an ultra marathon, you're just out there for so much longer than you are in a marathon. But I think we can still take some valuable lessons from it, because when you're out there, you're making these decisions, like hundreds of micro decisions all the time. Should I pick up my pace? Should I increase my turnover? How's my arms weight? How's my foot strike? Is it time to take another gel? Am I close enough to a water station that I can take something to drink with the gel? You know, all these things, they add a burden to your mind, and you're making these decisions, and it can just add to stress. And all that stress leads to mental fatigue. Look, you're already going to be physically tired, but hopefully your training has taught you how to get through that physical tiredness. But the mental fatigue can sometimes be a little more overwhelming. And a way to keep an eye on this is to notice if you start making mistakes, like if you're not taking a drink at a water station, or if your feet start scuffing. The article says something like if you start tripping over pretty easy terrain, but that's probably unlikely in a road marathon. But if you do start tripping on a regular basis, it's probably a good sign you're getting a bit tired. But yeah, just keep an eye on that stuff. And also, how are you emotionally reacting to these mistakes? So the article points out that a DNF-worthy mental challenge is when you have an inappropriate emotional reaction to something that happened. So for example, let's say I'm running along and I miss the water station and I realize, oh my gosh, I have to run another mile before I get a sip of water. And then I just sit down on the floor and I start crying. That is an inappropriate emotional response to something that is fairly minor. And at that point, I should remind myself, Matt, you're probably mentally tired. You need to get over this and move on. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done, but that's it. By saying that, I want you to recognize when you start having these reactions to something that might not fit the actual situation. But let's just circle back to planning, because I think that we all need to have a plan of what's going to happen that could lead to us not finishing a race. So me, talking to you now, I'm actually filming this a couple of days before I leave to go to Toronto, even though you are watching this video the day after I have run the Toronto Marathon. But because we're talking about it now and I have my race in a couple of days, I am now making a plan that if I miss a water station, I don't get a drink, that is not going to be a reason for me to not finish the race. I think my plan needs to be a little more in depth than that, but that seems like a good starting point. Okay, that was mental. Now let's talk about physical for a second, and I think the physical things are a little easier to wrap our heads around. So let's just say that I'm running a road marathon, and let's just say I trip over my feet. For some reason, there's nothing there, I just get tired and I trip over my feet. But when I fall down, I break a leg, right? That's a pretty legit reason to not finish the race. But guys, unfortunately, it's not always going to be that cut and dry, so you're probably going to have a plan in case something else happens. There are less obvious things that you may have to examine a little closer that you may not think will cause you to drop out, but maybe they should. So let's talk about GI distress and joint pain. And if that sets in kind of mid-race, that may be leading to something a little more serious, and that might be worth not finishing the race for. Of course, I think this is a lot easier said than done, because if you have GI distress and you just go to the loo, that GI distress may be relieved and you might be able to finish the race, but it may not be the right thing to do. And ditching a race because of GI distress is probably going to be pretty serious if you're running a hot race. Now look, the problem is because we are athletes and we are generally training to push through discomfort. But sometimes when we're running in hot weather, we get a little dehydrated. We just think, no, I'm going to push through it. This is what I've been training for. I'm going to push through this and I'm going to get to the finish. But the problem is that the initial signs of heat stroke are GI distress. The tricky thing is that GI distress is something that we are probably familiar with as runners. But if you're running in a hot climate, you may want to think about just analyzing, is it super hot? Have I been drinking enough? Because the article points out that heat stroke starts in the gut. Did you know that? I didn't know that. And then of course, if your GI symptoms worsen and then they're followed by confusion or headache, or you stop sweating, or you're sweating too much, these are all serious things that it's definitely worthwhile ditching your race for. Look, no race is worth dying for. No race is worth seriously injuring yourself for. Although I bet there are a couple of you out there that would argue the other way. Now, if you do make it to the start line, relatively healthy, one way to keep an eye on how you're feeling, your level of health, is by looking at your heart rate. Now, a lot of you already train by heart rate, so this shouldn't be a new concept. But looking at your heart rate before you start the race, that's going to give you a good idea of how calm you are. And then obviously when you start training, you're going to want to make sure your heart rate doesn't get too high so your pace becomes unmanageable. And because you're already familiar with how your heart rate should respond because of your training, you know where it should be. And if your heart rate is going up at a moderate effort, that's a good sign that you are dehydrated. And of course, this next part seems pretty obvious, but the article writes it, so I'm going to tell you, and you may want to write this down just in case. But a high heart rate combined with nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, that's a good sign to stop and reassess your race. Oh, and this is one of those things that you're going to say, duh, but it's worth telling you that if you hear a pop or you have extreme pain in a bone or a joint, that's a hard stop. That is definitely worth stopping and not finishing the race. And that actually reminds me of, I think it was 2014 at the Boston Marathon. I was at the Citgo sign and I was going up that little hill over the bridge, but I heard a pop in my hip, and that pop was followed by quite a bit of pain, and that pain continued with every step. But because it's only like a mile and a half to the finish from that point, I figured I was gonna muscle through and just get to the finish. Anyway, long story short, I actually broke my hip that day, although strangely I don't regret finishing the race. That's probably because it happened 9 years ago, so it's easy for time to kind of dull the poor choices that I made. But if it happens to you, I want you to not finish the race. That is definitely the best course of action. I was out for a very long time after that race, and I probably wouldn't have been out of as long if I had stopped right away. But anyway, this video has gone on a bit with just me rabbiting on. But if you have made it to this point, you know the drill. I want you to drop the puffin head emoji in the comments just to let me know you've stayed all the way to the end. If you can't find the puffin head emoji, go ahead and comment puff puff. No reason for the puffin, doesn't mean anything. Don't know if I've ever actually seen a puffin. Maybe in a zoo, but not that I can remember. And you know what? I'm going to take my own advice because it seems like that I am presenting with some dehydration symptoms. I'm getting confused. I'm talking about irrational things. So with that, be kind, be happy, run well, and I'll see you in a couple of days.